everybody. Chris Jerome of the Radical Independent Facebook page. I'm here with Robert Talisse, W. Alton Jones Professor of Philosophy and Professor of Political Science at Vanderbilt University. It's great to be able to talk to you. Thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me, Chris. Looking forward to talking.
Awesome. I want to mention some of your work you've done. You've written a lot of scholarly articles, over 100. It looks like. um, a lot of research on polarization related topics, but also a lot of popular articles featured in various publications. I want to actually link to some of those, especially some of the more recent ones.
Okay.
Um, Also, a lot of videos out there. Just anybody can Google your name, and they're going to come across some videos that you've done. I know you had a Why We Argue podcast a while back.
Right. Yeah, that was with a grant that some friends in the Humanities Center at University of Connecticut had asked me to do. So that ran for a couple of years, and then the grant
Right.
money was spent, and
That was it.
that was the end. Yeah, yeah.
Is it
Things
still
end.
up for people to listen to?
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's at
Um,
the University of Connecticut Humanities Center. It should have links to it.
you've also written quite a few books. You've been a very busy man. I feel like I need to talk to you for about 8 hours just to cover things.
uh, well, it's my job.
Right. So I know you have a newer book out, Civic Solitude, right?
Yeah, that's right.
That's cool. I want to get into that at some point. The one that I've actually read and I want to kind of focus on for now, though, is one called Sustaining Democracy.
Okay, good.
It's awesome. Sustaining
Thank you.
Democracy, What We Owe to the Other Side. I think the title kind of hints at some things there. What can you say about why did you say it that way? What we owe to the other side.
Well, you know, um, a lot of a lot of writing at the time. That book came out only a couple years ago. Just for context, it's the second book in a trilogy.
Okay.
Civic Solitude is the third in the trilogy, and the first was a book called Overdoing Democracy: Why We Must Put Politics in Its Place. And Sustaining Democracy is that second of the three books, and it's mainly about how it's whether and how it's possible to sustain healthy democratic relations with our fellow citizens when we can't help but see them as on the side of injustice. And so part of what that book is about is it tries to take very seriously the kind of democratic citizen who thinks that he or she owes nothing to the other side, not because they're just interested in getting their way, but because they are convinced that their political opposition is beyond the pale. And so, what I try to argue in that book, appealing to some of the dynamics that are broadly discussed under the rubric of polarization. What I try to say in that book is that we think of polarization often in terms of sort of the toxic relations between opposing sides, when really polarization is a series of dynamics that impacts our coalitions as much as it impacts our relations between our allies and our foes, or relations with our foes. And so the argument of the book roughly is that sustaining democratic relations with your political opponents is valuable, in part because it's necessary to sustain such relations with your opponents if you're going to sustain democratic relations with your friends.
Okay.
And so that's how the argument of the book works. It's that we kind of need our political enemies, because without them, our alliances fall apart. Does that make
Hmm.
sense?
Yes. That's what I was thinking. I mean, I read your book, but I'm not an expert, and everybody takes away different things. But when we talk about what we owe to the other side, that's pretty much in line with kind of how I was thinking about it.
Yeah. Here's the hard part about democracy. You know, it's an odd moral proposal, right? Democracy
Right.
is the moral proposal that we can live together peacefully, relatively justly, without being ruled by a king or a leader or a guru, right? We don't need superiors and subordinates to live peacefully together. Well, what does that take? Well, democracy is the proposal then that we could live together as equals, right?
Right.
And it's the equal standing of our fellow citizens, even when we see them as very grossly mistaken
Yeah.
about what's right.
Right.
It's like it's a tough pill to swallow, but it's what I the whole trilogy is invested in this idea that the role of the democratic citizen is to inhabit this sort of conflicted stance, where we're supposed to deploy our shred of political power in the ballot box with, participating in politics,
Yeah.
joining coalitions, right, to advance justice as we best can see it. I mean, that's part of what the democratic citizen is supposed to do, sort of take up a common the view of the common good, or a sort of public spirited view, and try to make our little slice of the political world that we have some middling amount of power over, try to deploy that power in a way that makes the world better. Well, at the same time, we have to recognize our fellow citizens as our equals,
Right.
not merely, like people who get an equal say, but people who are entitled to an equal say. And being wrong about politics, I mean, within very broad constraints, right? We could talk about people who are really beyond the pale if you want, but the spectrum of permissible political opinion within a democratic society is quite broad, and people who seem to us to have really poor political judgment
Yeah.
are nonetheless entitled to an equal say. It's a
So
tough it's a tough position, right?
yes. Yeah. Democracy is not easy. So
Democracy is not easy, right? Good.
right. Do you well, okay, so you talk about belief polarization, the tendency of like-minded groups to kind of become more extreme in their thinking. Do you think this is a lack of civic education, a lack of developing normal democratic norms, or are there external factors that are kind of beating us down in that direction, or is it a combination of both?
It's a really good question, and it would be very surprising to me, and should be surprising to you, if there were like a silver bullet
Right.
explanation,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
there's not going to be one thing that explains all the badness. So that's the first thing to say. Surely, uh, the ways in which we as a society have divested from civics and have become increasingly more comfortable with the idea that politics, and political office in particular, is not a public service role, but is more, more like an adversarial.
Mm-hmm.
Politics is about winning. It's not about serving the
Right.
public or serving the common good. Sort of, we've given up, if that's what we mean by like civic education, sort of puts us in the mindset, keeps us mindful of the idea that politics is this, frustrating, sometimes very tense, sometimes sort of based in struggle, kind of collective endeavor by which we all can somehow live well together in ways that we can't live well alone, right?
Right.
If we've given up on that, I think that's part of the story for sure. I think
Oh,
another part of the story is
yeah.
that socially, in the last 30 to 40 years, I'm old enough to remember before there was an internet, right?
Right. Me too.
Good, right? It just more and more. And by the way, a lot of people blame the internet for almost everything that goes wrong in the world. I'm not one of those guys. But it does seem to me that more and more of our day to day lives are subject to our own choosing. in ways that when I was a child and for my parents were just unimaginable. That you could, within 20 minutes have somebody deliver, Arabic food to your house in the middle of Nashville, Tennessee, right? More and more of the way that we live in our day-to-day settings is the product of our own choosing, our own latitude. We have more control over the features of our day-to-day social environments than was imaginable in the, even in the 90s. And I think that perhaps, unsurprisingly, we tend to use that kind of latitude to create our social environments in our own image, right?
Right.
To fix things around us so that they kind of like feel familiar and feel comfortable to us. Now, that is what it is, and I'm not saying that we all need to put ourselves on edge, but it does have costs in that when we surround ourselves with experiences, with messaging, with other people that we can choose in advance so that we know what they're going to say, what those environments are going to be like, what we're going to see and hear and be exposed to. There are just, I think, civic costs to
Right.
that. Our
Yeah.
conception of what's normal and acceptable and permissible gets shrunk. And we start to think that democracy is possible only when everyone's just like me.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that is the most anti-democratic thought. I think you can read Plato or any of the other like anti-democratic philosophers all day. You're not going to find something quite as sort of thoroughly anti-democratic as that idea. Democracy is great, but it's possible only when everyone's just like this guy.
Right.
That's just fundamentally anti-democratic. But
That's
that's what this latitude creates. That
right.
makes sense?
That's a great observation. So when you talk about the belief polarization, are you're focusing more on the policies, the facts, the I talked to a behavioral economist the other day, and he talked a lot about effective um,
Right,
polarization, where it was more of a social aspect,
right.
where it's like we're not even really arguing about policies anymore, or facts anymore. It's just more this is my group, they're
Yeah,
the other group, we're opposed, and it's become more of this social
sure.
aspect involved. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so, again, polarization is this word that everybody
Yep.
throws around, and there are lots of distinct phenomena that are indexed
Yep.
by that term. And it helps, I think, to sort of disambiguate them so that you can then sort of fit them together, because I think that they do fit together. So let's just start very, very quickly. Right? We can say that political polarization, this is just like me stipulating some terminology here, right? We need a term that describes the phenomenon by which two opposed political units pull apart and the common ground between them or among them falls away. And I'm just going to say that's political polarization.
Very broad in
Political
general.
polarization, yeah, very broad. Political polarization is not always bad, by the way, right? Like when the two major parties in a country like the US are sort of very, very far apart ideologically, it makes it very easy for the everyday citizen to understand what's at stake in an election, for example,
Yeah.
right? So, you know, the standard line among political scientists in the 50s and the early 60s, the part of the 60s that were still the 50s, that explained plummeting voter turnout was not enough polarization,
Hmm.
right? Citizens thought that the two parties were kind of like, just different, different variations on the same thing. So, like, what does it matter who gets
Right.
into office? So, some degree of distinctness and even maybe some degree of hostility is a good way for citizens to be able to pick up on signals on what the
Right.
differences are.
Right.
So
That
poli-
tension within democracy, that's how things get better, right? A little tension, a little
this
conflict. That's what how we make progress.
That's exactly right. And, politics is important. There's things at stake. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
I'm not one of, it's very easy in my line of work, sort of democratic theory, to even to this day, to come across people who think that if we just get democracy right, or if we
Hmm.
just get civic virtue right, or if we just get people's practices or the way they talk to each other right, democracy smooth sailing. Seems to me democracy is never smooth sailing. And that's a good thing, right? We agree on that. That's a good thing because I think that there's real winners and losers. There's stuff that's at stake that's really important. And so some degree of antagonism is just part of the story of democracy. The trick is to figure out how to contain that antagonism within a set of norms that reminds us of the common purpose that it's all for, right?
Right.
Living together as equals, right? Yeah, let me just say political polarization is just this metric of ideological distance. Belief polarization is not a metric of the distance between opposing parties. Belief polarization is a cognitive phenomenon that occurs within members of a like minded group. It's the yes man phenomenon. So it's,
Okay.
you surround yourself with people who agree with you, you turn into a more extreme version of yourself.
Hmm.
Now, that extremity sort of comes in various forms. You start believing more extreme things. You start having a greater degree of confidence in the more extreme things that you come to believe, and you become more assured of your capacity to judge those things. Now, here's the connection with what you mentioned about the behavioral economics guy you were talking to. Affective polarization is the name that we give for a metric of the negative feelings
Okay.
citizens have for perceived political outgroup members, and correspondingly, although not identically, the positive feelings they feel for perceived in-group members. Now, here's the where you start seeing how these pieces fit together. We've got political polarization, we have belief polarization, and now we just mentioned affective polarization. As you become more extreme in your beliefs, in belief polarization, people who disagree with you look weirder to you, right? They
Right.
look less competent to you. They look more dangerous, benighted, dishonest. And so you can see high degrees of belief polarization travel with intensified affective polarization. The more extreme you become, the less trustful you are of anybody who appears to you to be an outsider. And so those two sort of phenomena, both called polarization, belief and affective polarization, sort of are tied in together. They
Right.
travel together. Now, here's the way to close the loop. Um, when you've got an electorate that is heavily belief polarized, so they're extreme, they're insular. Everybody who's not like them looks weird and dangerous and depraved and benighted and ignorant and untrustworthy. So they hive off and see the outsiders as kind of contagious and
Right.
to be avoided.
Yeah.
When you've got an electorate that's sorted, that's divided up that way, the job of every office seeking politician and their handlers and the campaign managers and the campaign strategists have become incredibly easy all of a sudden, because now you don't have to change anybody's heart and mind.
Right.
You just have to mobilize the people
Yep.
that if they are to vote, they're going to vote for you. So you
Yeah.
have to figure out ways to mobilize your people and, right, and figure out a way to suppress the political behavior of your opposition,
Right.
right? To get them demoralized. And it turns out this is just how we're built, right? This is the kind of creature that we are at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Fear, disgust, these are really potent
Oh yeah.
behavioral triggers for human beings. And so part of the the sort of interaction of belief polarization and affective polarization makes more and more of our political behavior triggerable by way of this affective stuff, right?
Right.
These negative emotions.
Right.
That's what your the other guy you were talking to is about, right?
Yeah.
No, I don't. It's not. Let me just put this in one final data point here. Forget about the parties and the party elites and the platforms. Forget about all that. We're just talking now about rank and file U.S. citizens who affiliate. They don't have to be an official member of a party, but sort of see themselves as a Republican or a Democrat. The electorate, understood in that way in the United States, is no more divided over policy issues than it was in 1993. So the actual like nuts and bolts, rubber hits the road issues that are like, what is the government's purpose? What are its responsibilities? What should it be doing? What should it be prioritizing? Republicans and Democrats are divided. They're not more divided than they were when Bill Clinton was president. What has escalated is negative affect, right?
Okay.
But
Yeah.
that's there's the puzzle, right?
Right.
It's like we're not, the actual like policy questions, not really what's driving, the policy differences are not what's driving our dislike, our animosity, our disgust with the other side, right?
Right.
And it turns out, here's just it's like not only do we hate each other more, irrespective of the fact that we don't like actually disagree over like nuts and bolts things more fervently, we as an electorate we've come to be entertained by and we've come to enjoy hating the other side.
Right. And
That's the
that's
real problem.
yeah. I mean, I 100% agree. When I talk about things on my page, the policy differences haven't changed all that much since I've been paying attention to things since the 90s. But like you said, when we're appealing to the worst aspects of our side and attacking the other side, legislative accomplishments, reaching out, those are the types of things that suffer. It's not so much the policy itself; it's all the
That's right.
it's the governing process and the legislating process that just falls apart.
That's right. So when belief polarization and affective polarization are pronounced, intransigence on the part of elected officials is a good strategy politically. It pays,
Right.
right? Amplifying your hatred for the other side, calling the other side lunatics,
Yeah.
haters of democracy, whatever it may be, right? That pays because that keeps the people who are your base tuned in and ready to engage politically, give money, phone bank, and ultimately vote. So it's a sad, it's a sad sort of pathology of democracy, we might say,
Yeah.
that the actual politics, like being engaged politically under the conditions under which, we now do politics, is actually, can be really hazardous for your civic health. Right.
Yeah.
These pathologies, these dysfunctions are more pronounced in people who are paying more attention to politics, because more and more of our political news diets, more and more of how we think and engage and interact with politics is already formulated, is already cast in a partisan idiom that sort of brings with it the sort of hostilities and the animosities that wind up sort of being distractions from like actual policy issues that government needs to address. Does that make sense?
Yeah, there's a lot of perverse incentives out there that encourage that. I got a quick comment, and
Yeah.
maybe I'm totally wrong. So, in your book, it sounds like you're kind of saying that democracy has a lot of baked-in elements that can be destructive. I mean, you got sort of the good versions of democracy. You could have bad democracy, sort of Madison's nightmare of.
Right.
So I don't know if it's a values neutral concept, but it depends on how it's practiced and how it's used. That there's many forms of democracy, and some's better than others, and we've slipped.
No, right. No, that seems right. Let me just add like one little sort of one little addendum, right?
Yeah.
Again, in my line of work, sort of democratic theory among academics, again, there is this sense, and part of it goes back like all the way, to, great, American democratic theorists like John Dewey and Jane Addams,
Right.
right? Who agreed the cure for democracy's problems is always more democracy, right? I don't know that that's true, right? It seems to me that democracy has baked within it sort of values that can conflict, and that we as citizens are often sort of caught in between sort of the goods that come with political allyship, right? Coalition building, working with people who are like-minded to try to make the world better as we agree can be made better. Those are all like social goods that democracy makes available to us, like the goods of political participation, those sort of like old school Republican in the philosophical sense of that term goods, right? Being a full member of a society that governs itself, that's a good for us. But of course, those goods sort of create a tension with our moral duties as citizens, our civic duties to treat those among our fellow citizens who count as our opponents, treat them as also our fellow citizens, right? That, how many times, if you're politically, I'm sure you are or know a lot of people who are politically engaged. They're building coalitions, they're joining groups, they're going to the meetings, they're getting out, they're getting out the vote, they're canvassing, they're doing all those things. Like if somebody in like a group, like a coalition setting, sort of stops and says, "Hey, everybody, maybe we ought to invite somebody from the other side to one of our meetings just to hear what they have to say." This is a good way to raise the suspicion among your allies that
Yeah.
you're not all in, right? Right. Sort of like the throes of politics and coalition building sort of lead us to a stance according to which the other side has to be shut down,
Right.
or at least ignored, and that's anti-democratic too.
Right. I I get a little bit of that on my page. I'm not a fan of utopianism. I'm not that sort of like the silver bullet, or if we just do the right, put in the right policies, everything would be amazing. And I think both the right and the left kind of go down that rabbit hole of their version of, it's like we've lost a little bit of ability to live within a certain amount of tension and
Yeah.
conflict and disagree and stuff like that. Here's my sort of last major question: is
Yeah.
progress possible based on what's going on in the world, in our country now, and your research, and is it fixable? Is progress possible? And if so, how does that even happen?
So I think yes, I think it's possible. I think that it's very easy in not only in my line of work, but also in just sort of commentaries about what's going on, what's going wrong with democracy. The tendency to look towards the institutions and to think about sort of large scale institutional reform, or to think about the claim that the source of all the trouble is the two-party system. By the way, maybe that's true. Not
I talk
denying
about
any
that.
of this, right? Not denying any of this. But it just looks to me, it's like, you know what? Here's a hard, I think, fact that we need to confront as a democratic electorate, as a collection of citizens. Maybe we're getting the politics that we deserve.
Yeah.
And if we don't like that politics, maybe something about us needs to change first, right? I tend to say, and sort of tend to cast in this trilogy of books, the people already holding office, the major party members, the party leadership is the parties are the beneficiaries of all the toxicity. They're not changing anything, right? They like to talk about turning down the temperature and being more civil, and we're unifying. And, I remember Joe Biden's inaugural unity. They like talking that way. But the actual business of politics, and let's not forget, it's a business, it's a livelihood, right? Um, these are people are benefiting from these dysfunctions. So I don't think that starting at the level of large scale institutions and the parties is going to be a winning way forward. I think that, although I don't think it's sufficient, I think part of what has to happen is we need to start reevaluating our own political instincts and habits,
Yes.
and seeing ourselves as criticizable and as potentially improvable. That's the thing that I think. That's the thing that most depresses me among the people who I count as my allies in politics. Right, the people who want the things that I want. Right,
Yep.
you know, is the idea that if you've got the right political ideas, you as a political civic agent don't stand in need of improvement
Right.
and are beyond critique. It seems to me like no, you can know what justice requires. You can know what the right policies are with respect to immigration, with respect to the environment. You can have all the right views about what government should be doing, but you yourself might still be falling short as a civic partner. That possibility seems to have escaped the notice
Right.
of a lot of citizens.
Well, it kind of goes with some of the research that I've seen lately, where some of the most biased people are the most highly educated, and
Yeah,
because they're really good, they know a lot, and they're really good at convincing themselves and building that confirmation bias.
that's right. That's right. No, I think that that's exactly right. And here's just one way to sort of encapsulate what I think is the underlying philosophical principle about democracy that is, I think, that we've lost sight of, right? The question about what justice requires or what policies are such that were they to be instituted, society would become more just or better or more perfectly democratic, a more perfect union, right? Right.
Yeah.
The question about justice in a democracy is never simply the question of how should the world be. It's the question, rather, what can I ask the government to force other people to do in the name of making the world how it should be?
Right.
And that is just a fundamentally, I think, importantly distinct kind of question.
Yeah.
I think that in our democracy, we've lost sight of that. We've got tribes that are fighting for their view of how things should be. Maybe one of them is correct. Maybe they're all wrong. Maybe one of them is correct, though. It's just that, look, if we're trying to live together as a society of self governing equals, the question about politics is never simply the question, how should things be? It's how can the government force people to behave in order to make the world more like how it should be? And that's just different. That's just a different question. And I think that part of our progress in democracy and part of democratic repair, I would say, must involve refamiliarizing ourselves with that fact.
Yeah. Awesome. So, Robert, I this was very enlightening. Great. I'm so glad I was able to talk with you. And
Happy. Yeah, great. Thank you for reaching out.
all right, thank you.